Okay, so we have right now this exam scheduled for Thursday. And the way it fell this year, usually I would offer if I had 2 different days to do it, but I have an 11 and a 2. So in essence, all I could ask is if you needed a choice, if any of you wanted to do it at 2 o'clock, just let me know, okay? So the final will be multiple guess, no essays. It will be probably around 40 to 50 questions. I'm going to redesign the test and cut down the numbers because the work that we're having to do in the last week and a half is going to be very busy. And I apologize. My daughter she runs high fevers. It's kind of this strange thing. She's gone to 102 and 104 in a couple of days, and then all of a sudden it'll go. And so anyway, without going further on, we will not have the last position paper. I've decided simply that's too much to come in at the very end, especially when you're going to have 3 chapters that you're going to need to absorb. So this chapter we're going to talk about power, then we'll talk about conflict, and then finally we'll talk about relationships. One of those will be recorded, and so you'll need to use the recording to prepare for the exam. The exam is online, all right? So you don't have to be in this class. You can be wherever you wish, take the online exam. Also, what I'll do is that I will have an optional, usually 4 or 5 bonus questions. It takes 2 minutes to take. It'll add to your grade, your choice, okay? So that's how we'll do it. Really good job, by the way. That's my 3rd test is usually the toughest test as well. Some of you really use the bonus questions to your complete advantages. I had 3 students over 100, and I can only report 100 on As You Learn, but I have a spreadsheet and I'll use those to calculate your final averages. You're not going to lose points, okay? So any questions? All right, without further ado, let us roll on. Okay, so in 1992, Walmart established what they call their vendor management system, or VMS. The vendor management system was Walmart's desire to push IT to its maximum benefit for an overall system-wide advantage. The difficulty that meant for the vendors is that the vendors had to invest in tens of thousands of dollars of equipment in order to continue to be a vendor with Walmart. Well, having said that, was there any good that came out of it? And the answer is absolutely yes. The vendor management system at Walmart allows every individual vendor to be able to see exactly where all of their goods are on every shelf in the world at real time. And it was an enormous advantage, but it would not have happened unless Walmart was willing to do something like exert power. And so this is an example of power. Power resides in everything we do. It's part of our daily lives. It is one of those things that we have to understand and accept is there. I could spend a semester just talking about power and power psychology and leadership that goes along with it, but we've only got a little bit of time to do it, so we're going to have to encapsulate it all right here. So what is power? Let's talk about power as we can define. First, as I've said, every part of channels, every part of our lives is permeated by power. And there are many ways in which power is not used. It's many times we have to understand that powers are not equivalent, that we have power that is asymmetric, but we have to understand power is basically the ability to exert influence. All right? To exercise power is to exert influence on one or more subjects. It is the potential for influence. It doesn't actually exist if who you're acting on does not find any advantages. And so, what is power? Power comes down to a very simple formula. Power is the ability of one channel member A to get another channel member B to do something it would not otherwise have done. Power is difficult to diagnose. It's hard to know whether we're getting it right or not. Power is the potential for influence, but not necessarily influence. There's always the possibility of what's called a false positive, okay? An example would be Walmart doing what they were doing, insisting that their individuals put in this whole new computer system in order to keep in contact with them. However, they may have had on the drawing board 6 months to a year before all of these exact same things coming in as well. And so it is sometimes difficult to know whether or not you're actually exerting power. The possibility of false positives are very common. It's hypothetical, it's impossible to verify, and yet it exists. It is exactly like knowing that planets circle other suns. We know this because of the evidence that comes from a secondary source, but sometimes it's almost impossible to verify. You only know power when you see it. All right, it's just like art. Now, when is power good? Power can be good when it is good for the system. Power can be important and solve many issues when it brings about a system-wide change. If only one individual in the environment is given an advantage, then power is used wrong. And how about we use power or its different permutations depends on the individual who is the decision maker. And we're going to talk about the 5 pieces of power, or the 5 unique parts of what power is. And so, the 5 sources of power. Power has been talked about to death, okay, in channels. At one point during the 80s, I was talking to one of my professors when I was getting my PhD school. Power was on just about everything in marketing channels for about 3 years. And then at one point, one of the journal articles said, we've taken enough journal articles about power, don't ever talk about it again. We don't want to hear it. We're not going to review it, blah, blah, blah. But still, it still exists. Power also comes up a lot in leadership psychology. To understand power many times is a way of understanding the individuals who are leading you. And so this is a really good, important thing for you to learn, is to understand where power comes from, and then also how it can be exerted in a successful way. And so this is one of those usual screens we have, and we're going to go on to the next one. But it's important to understand that power can only be exerted with a valuable proposition that appeals to B. All right? If B does not find A's position valuable, then they'll consider the exertion of power, no matter in what way, unjust. And so let's talk about them one at a time. Here we go. Reward power. Reward power is a benefit given in return for channel member B's willingness to alter their behavior. Honey, if you do your homework, I'll give you a cookie. Usually the emphasis is on financial rewards within the distribution channel, but non-financial compensation has become more and more valuable. Non-financial compensation such as rewards and recognition. In any way that we can try to boost the capabilities to increase profit. Those are all considered reward power. You can reward the downstream members by increasing the rewards to them, but the downstream partners can reward the upstream partners basically by establishing markets. Just give me Avery County and I will increase profits there by 40%. That would be an example of a downstream reward power, okay? And then if you do, that having that benefit come through. And so the difficulty with reward power is it becomes almost addictive in a way. My daughter will come to me the next day and said, I did my homework, where's the cookie? All right, that would be an example. And so the classic example also is sales promotions versus normal advertising. Sales promotions try to get you to buy something within a specific period of time. And the difficulty with that is that it doesn't change you. You don't change your brand loyalties with sales promotions. And people expect to have promotion every time. How many times have we ordered pizza without checking what are the specials? I mean, I do. And so that's reward power. Coercive power can be considered synonymous in the reverse of reward power, but it's not, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. Coercive power stems from B's expectation of punishment by A if it fails to conform with A's influence attempt. Now, this isn't asymmetric and is not a flip side, because coercive power can be considered to be a threat. Coercive power damages relationships. It erodes the personal relationship we have with each other. Many times the influencers fail to grasp what they're doing. And depending on the individual, the coercive can be very deeply hurt. And so coercive power, usually if you're going to use it, you have to use coercive power as a last refuge. So, reward power, the ultimate is satisfaction, all right? Coercive power is dissatisfaction. Now, here's a problem in this whole scheme. Satisfaction is just meaning you've met the expectations. Satisfied tends to be more of a passive kind of emotion. Dissatisfaction is a call to action. If I'm dissatisfied with something, there's a very good chance I'm going to complain about it. And so that's the difficulty with coercive power. Once you've used it, also, it rarely works again. Coercive power erodes the number of times you do it. Many times because it sometimes becomes a false threat. And even if you follow through, you're never the same again in your relationship. Expert power. So expert power is based on the target's perception that the influencer has some kind of special knowledge or expertise. This is called expert. You might even see it called expertise. They have multiple ways of saying this. The difficulty with expert powers, especially if you have this unique knowledge or whatever, okay, is that it's a very easy thing to dissipate and even disappear in an instant. Now, expert power can be thought of in a source of knowledge in which you have information that is considered valuable, or it can be thought of as your ability to have good judgments. You're always guessing right. You just have your finger on the pulse about what can go wrong. When I was working in IT, this is almost 30 years ago, they were doing great chefs in New Orleans. I lived in Lafayette, which is about 130 miles away. They couldn't get their machine rolling. And they're having to print out their books because they were, doing this book and it needed to be going to the publisher. And I was like, well, you got to pay me $35 an hour on the road and 30 bucks. So I said, yes, hurry. So I went over to there and I found out their booth structure, somebody had put a comma in it, and all it was just that one comma. So I fixed it in 5 minutes, and they took me out and gave me drinks. But sometimes that expertise, that ability to make a good judgment is what's considered to be expert. It's not easy to use. The channel member needs to be trusted. Usually they're recorded a high status. And the other part of that is that independent-minded people don't like to be told what to do, all right? And the other part of that is that sometimes the knowledge creeps away. And so you got to be very careful about how you go about pulling out that knowledge, all right? So what is the ways, okay, that you can, how can you keep expert power? One way is to continually renew your knowledge. I spend constant time reading, because the reading always keeps me up to date. The next is you don't give up all your information. So my ultimate thing when I was doing IT, when I was in my 20s, when somebody would ask me, how did you do that? I'd say, hire me and I'll tell you. I mean, it comes down to that at some point. You can't give away. And I used to be one of those people who listen to myself talk, still do. But you just got to learn. Machiavelli said, you're always smarter when you say less, okay? So just kind of remember that. You're always smarter when you say less. So, expert power. Legitimate power comes into 2 ways, all right? Legitimate power comes into legal legitimate and traditional legitimate. So, legal stems from the target's sense that it is some way obligated to comply with the request of the influencers. And there are two sources of legitimate power, and they are separate. Legal legitimate power stems from contracts and commitments. Traditional legitimate comes from societal norms. A norm is an accepted code of behavior in existing in a legitimate society, okay? So that's what a norm is. And so legal legitimate power is conferred by governments stemming from contracts and commerce. And that's where the power comes from, contracts. But it also comes into the norms, the values, and the beliefs that you have in the organizations. And so let me give you an example. This is a true to life example for me. So I created internet service providership in 2000. I ran from 2000 to 2004. I had 1,900 subscribers. I was making $42,000 a month. And then Walmart in 2004 came out with $4.95 internet for dial-up. And that, in essence, created my corporation. So I was trying to renegotiate with Bell South at the time, which they were Bell corporations, to renegotiate my contracts because quite simply, it was taking me out of business. And I started getting calls at night. I was being harassed. The bill went up to $100,000. And in desperation, I went to the person who did my contracts, and that was a gentleman by the name of Forrest Danton. So Forrest Danton was actually the city judge in Columbia, Mississippi, but he also did county work outside. Great guy. Forrest was just awesome. His dad actually ran for governor of Mississippi. And he did all my contracts, and he was also, I gave him free high-speed internet. I gave him DSL when it just come out. And I just poured my heart out to him, and I just told him what was going on. And I didn't know what to do. And Forrest waited for me to finish, and he said, F him. Forrest was a deacon in his church. Forrest never cursed in his life, and I never heard him curse again. And I went, excuse me? And he said, David, I wrote the contracts. You don't own anything in the corporation. You just work for the corporation. If they want to sue the corporation, go right ahead, but they can't touch you. He said, go ahead and just close it, file it out, sell your assets, and then go on with your life. So this is an example of legal legitimate and traditional legitimate power. By traditional legitimate power, they were trying to force me to pay for this, even though contractually, legal legitimate, I had no reason to. And so realize these are the two things. By the way, if you ever go in business, get a good lawyer. That's all I can say. So, legitimate power. Referent power exists when A or B views A as a standard of reference and therefore wishes to identify publicly with A. So when we had all of our IT issues going on and Columbia Data Products went out of business when I was with Omni Computer Store, I urged them to let's see if we could get an IBM dealership. And IBM sent me like a 20-page dealership form, because to identify, especially in the 80s, with those three big blue letters was gold in your ordinance. Okay, so I want to be identified as using that device. And smart corporations provide you with identifiers of their equipment so that you're seen wearing it. It's no it's no coincidence that when you flip your laptops, that the Apple logo face up. There's a reason for it, okay? Because of referent power, the reference of that. Because you want to be identified using it. It's a very strong thing. It's why they put brand names on there, why they do logos. Because the identification, the reference for that is very valuable. So before I go on, I'm just going through these just to let you know. Okay, so reward, coercive, and legal legitimate are known as position power. All right. These are powers that have to do with your position in any structure. The higher you are in a structure, the greater reward power, the greater expert power, and the greater legal legitimate power you have. Expert power, referent power, and traditional legitimate power are what are known as personal power. This is power that is associated with individuals. All right. So I have strong expert. I'm an expert in a lot of things. I have highly specialized knowledge. I make good choices. In referent power, I am at a certain level. And no matter whether you think good or bad of me, if you were near me, you'd respect me. And traditional power, I am respected within the societal norms of the civilizations in which I work in. And so there are the 5 sources of power. So kind of putting all of these together, there are powers that are known as coercive power, and those are others that are known as non-coercive. So coercion, the removal of something, is basically a coercive power, and everything else is non-coercive. And then finally, there's mediated powers versus unmediated. Mediated are those powers when a target is forced to acknowledge where the power base comes from. You could look at these as the position powers, okay? So reward, coercive, and in my mind, legal legitimate should be there. Unmediated powers, these are the ones that don't exist without me perceiving them as being valuable. Expert, referent, and traditional. And if you want to think of a way of clustering them together, that's a good way to do it, okay? So the personal powers are the unmediated ones. And the position powers, those are the ones that are mediated, that come about basically in the positions that they're in. So, we talked about power, its nature, the 5 sources of power. Now we're going to talk about the other side. We're going to talk about what is needed in order for power to exist, and that is the concept of dependence. So, all for power to exist is to recognize that B depends more heavily on A when B gets more value, benefits from A. And here's the other thing. When B has fewer alternatives. This is one of the great examples of when Walmart started dominating the retail market, while Walmart flipped the model and power started residing in the retail versus the manufacturers. For decades and decades, power existed from the manufacturers. They could choose at will what stores they wanted to sell their products in. Walmart in the 60s came in, started building Walmarts every 6 weeks for 20 years, and Walmart dominated the retail landscape to the point where they are today. And what it means now is that the manufacturers have fewer places to be able to bring their products to market. And so this is where Walmart started influencing B. And so how do we define dependence in a calculation where we do it like this? Okay. Dependence equals the value, the benefits, and the satisfaction multiplied by alternate scarcity. D equals U times S. Now, scarcity being an increased, what happens if there's no scarcity at all, if this number is 0? If we're doing a calculation and we multiply it by 0, what's the answer? 0. Absolutely. So that's part of what this means is if I have unlimited numbers of places, then in essence, we have no dependence whatsoever. And so how readily B can replace A becomes one of the important things. Remember, the definition is the utility, the satisfaction, the value, the benefits that are derived, multiplied by the alternate scarcity. So that's defined for dependence. So how do you measure dependence? What are the ways in which we can think that we can define how dependent we are on one of our partners? Well, the first thing we need to do is, if the corporation that we are working with recognizes our goals and respects how we're pursuing our desires, then that is a way of measuring the utility. And so if the focal actors are concerned about our success, then that is one of the main points. The next is alternate scarcity. Who are the potential competitors out there as well? Look at it from the other direction. Walmart, in essence, dominated the department store era. We no longer had Montgomery Ward, Sears, locations that have been around for decades. There were, oh gosh, what was it, 6,000 department stores in the United States in the 80s that went out of business, and Walmart, in essence, took over that entire thing. So when you're looking at scarcity, how easily you can switch becomes a major way in which you measure. And so if you look at those two things, ultimately what it can help you do is measure just how much power that particular organization has and how much dependence you have on them. There are other ways of measuring it too, and these are actually hardwired measurements, okay? So what percentage of sales of profits does your channel partner contribute to? The higher the percentage, the higher the partner's dependence, and the more powerful a focal member they are. You can't capture all the benefits, but if you can capture financially, how much they contribute to your bottom line, then it's a very valuable thing to know. The other is, so, relational norms. How do they act in their interaction with you? Is there a genuine concern about your individual success? Are you merely just another cog in the wheel, some customer that they've got to take care of in order to finish their jobs? Service excellence always implies uniqueness. And so when we talk about service, just to give you an example, we go back, we talk about co-production and heterogeneity. If we talk about someone who cuts your hair, their uniqueness, their specialness with you comes down to only one individual who can satisfy you in that way. And so how well do they perform their roles in your service? And then the last is that you just do an inventory of the 5 sources. And then the extent of which, if your partner does a lot of reward power, if they tend to be referent, if there's a lot of personal power, there's an interaction in societal norms, there's that legitimate power that says, I'm your partner, and I'm working with you, and I'm going to make it stay that way. Those are examples. If you're a partner who basically says, pay up in 30 days and we'll shut you down, who calls you and says, remind you the bottom of the contract, it's now due, you have 10 days to fulfill, you've got an exact idea in terms of a bottom-up approach of how much they care. So it's also important to understand that dependence is never one way, that there should be a high interdependence between each other, which is synonymous with high mutual power. Procter & Gamble and Walmart have this unique relationship that has been going on for 30 years. Procter & Gamble is one of the largest sellers of consumer goods in the world. And Walmart has a very deep influence with Procter & Gamble. And by the very same token, Procter & Gamble has a very big influence on Walmart. When we talk about relationships, Walmart actually has a Walmart office inside the P&G headquarters. I believe it's Dayton, Ohio. And by the very same token, Procter & Gamble has an office in Bentonville. That's how close and interdependent they are. But just remember that relationships are very rarely symmetric. What you do find more is an asymmetric power balance. Most often you find a power imbalance, and usually the balance of power usually favors the less dependent member, and this is where the dependence part is important, okay? Power is reflected on the level of dependence that you have. The higher the dependence, the less the power. It creates what's known as an asymmetric relationship, when there is not a mutual advantage for staying together, where power is greater on another side. Asymmetric relationships are conflict-ridden, they're less trusting, and they're less committed than an interdependent relationship is. And so you might even actually find organizations with more power trying to create a greater interdependence. One of the things that was interesting in Tennessee, and I remember watching this, is when they tried to unionize one of the oh gosh, the Volkswagen plants in Tennessee. And the management actually was pushing the unionization quite simply because they wanted to create a more interdependent relationship, not necessarily confrontational, but they basically wanted to find some other way to create a more connected relationship. The workers turned them down. They were fine. They were happy because they didn't believe that the auto workers or the UAW would basically, what's the word I want to say, negotiate them with them in a way that was better than the way that they were already doing it. And that's an example of also an asymmetric relationship. They thought that the UAWs quite simply had too much power coming in and they rejected it. So how do you balance? Okay. So the first thing that you do if you're B and you're the weaker party is you try to find alternatives for A. So if I'm not getting good work out of the manufacturer that I was using, I try to find another manufacturer. And this is the most common. You never find Walmart who will use only one single supplier for all of their goods. They will find multiple suppliers, because that creates too much dependence on one channel member. If you notice, if you go to Mr. Tire, or if you go to any of the others, they're never going to focus on one single brand. They'll have multiple. A unique difference, and I always talk about this, is steel tools. Steel tools, there are 15,000 retail distributors of steel tools in the United States, and 11,000 of them are sole authorized dealers. In other words, they don't sell Husqvarna, they don't sell any of the others. They focus just on steel tools. And the reason they do that is because Steel Tools Corporate does everything they can to balance dependence. And so they're very, very friendly to their downstream independent providers. So much so that they will contribute 30% of the cost of remodeling, even if the remodeling in the store has nothing to do with steel. So that's one of the ways that you signal a greater need or an interdependence with each other. So this is another way, is that you organize a coalition to attack A. Now we're about to go through a paradigm shift, and I think we're going to be back to this. In the 50s, General Motors came up with a plan that they were going to start selling all of their goods, for the lack of a better word, through company stores or even mail order. All right. And what happened is the automobile dealerships of America got together, formed a coalition, and attacked General Motors. And it worked. General Motors backed away. But I've heard some interesting rumblings from all of the big three now that there's a consideration, especially with the internet coming into play, with COVID doing what it wants to. Ford might be the first corporation to make this leap. And if they do, boy, I have no idea how it's going to work out. No idea. So the second thing you do is you fight. You get a coalition. The next is, or the last is you just get out. You just withdraw from the business. You're no longer dealing in that group. This doesn't have to do with power, but quite simply the lack of power thereof. BlackBerry for years had made the number one secure phone in the world. But quite simply, BlackBerry could not continue. Now all they do is operating systems, and their phones are no longer in business. And so you have three, okay? You can develop alternatives, you can attack A, organize a coalition, or you can just exit the situation, get out, no longer be in it. But the truth of the matter is, more often than not, the dependent party just simply takes it, okay? You just make the best of it. You know, You try to rely on the internal norms to offset the dependence, and you kind of hope everything is going to work out. Now, it's not a bad thing. In a predictable market, it's okay. It's okay. If I have a consistent demand, if my store stuff is being sold, if my turnover ratio is decent, and I have limited inventory and I'm making profits, not as much as I'd like, yeah, I'll go along with it. However, in an uncertain market, you need high dependence, all right? You need to be motivated to stick together and to find common solutions together. So I was working with Corning on Wednesday, and they were talking about the problems that they had had with the bullwhip effect because they had so many suppliers out there ordering from them in enormous amounts. And then everything after COVID kind of backed up. And so they were having to balance that as well. And a lot of that they came out with fine because there's a mutual dependence. And they are satisfied with that mutual dependence. And so for tolerating dependence, if it's a predictable market, you go along with it. If it's an uncertain market, you hope to have a high mutual dependence. We're in this together kind of thing. All right. So the last thing is, how do we express ourselves in balancing power? What are the ways, the strategies that I can use to express power balance? It requires communication skills. It requires our ability to express our way in the use of these strategies to their best benefit. And how we go about using them ultimately determines success. So here are how we express ourselves in the uses of the powers. A promise is the use of reward power. If you do what we wish, we will reward you. Once again, remember the reward power you have to be very careful with, because when you use reward power, basically you're opening the door for constant use of it. But threat, just by its very word, your back gets up. If you don't do what we wish, we will punish you. Legalistic can be both legal and traditional legitimate. Do what we wish because we've agreed to do so. We have it on paper. Or the expectation is you've got to be able to fulfill your promises. All right, thank you all. Have a good day. So request, I think it's kind of funny. Request says, please do what you wish. But you know what? If you look at a book by C.L. Dini on influence, C.L. Dini is one of the great discussers on influence. And he said, it is amazing how powerful just asking can be as a strength. So C.L. Dini did this research that what they did was they put together this one person at a copy machine that waited until someone else was making copies. And they said, may I make copies first? And if they asked why, they would just say, I need to make copies. And what they found is that 86% of the people who were asked were happy to give up their space. And so it is surprising that just the request has enormous power as it does. And a lot of that also has to do with societal norms and our willingness to try to get along together. And so the request is actually a lot more powerful than you might think. The information exchange is basically your way of putting up a list of goods and bads and saying, let's talk about a general discussion of the most profitable way to run your business. And what its hope is that the conversation eventually turns itself in your direction. Doesn't mean that it always will. The last is recommendations. These last two take the most time, but the recommendation needs to be backed up with facts and logic. We recommend you do this, which is one of the reasons why we're finally at the end of the semester. I want you to write position papers, because position papers are how you express recommendations. Okay, so that's why you've been doing it. Yes, you can do skepticism and counter arguments. And one of the reasons in your position papers I say don't do the other hand is because somebody else is going to do it anyway. So that's why you write the position papers. It is these ways of expressing yourselves are how you go about exerting power. So the effectiveness of the strategies, a promise, threat, and spit it out, Dave. Legalistic influence often provoke backlashes. And what that means is a response back. That's what a backlash is, positive or negative. The requests, the information, and the recommendations are subtle, they're nuanced, they require a lot more work. And the last thing to recognize is that in Western countries, the subtle influences work, whereas overt strategies risk resentment. But it is not surprising if you are working in other cultures, if it seems like they're doing coercive power, where it may be legitimate power in another. We can sometimes consider individuals from other countries to be rude. And actually, most of those are just culturally based. We tend to nuance in the United States. We try to do more information. We tend to do more recommendations. In other cultures, it just doesn't fly. Let's get to the point, okay? And so all of these influence strategies where power is universal, the influences strategies tend to be based in our cultures, all right? Okay, so the last thing, these two things, valence as a definition means the attractiveness of something. How subtle are our influence strategies? So if I want to do a positive valence and I want to increase valence, I don't say you will get additional marketing support because that has no value to me. If I valence it and give it greater attractiveness, I say I will give you substantial additional marketing support. And so that's what valence means, okay? And by the very same token, negative is the same thing. And finally, rewards can be contingent or non-contingent. In other words, we either openly express, if you do this, you get this. Or what you do is that individual achieves, and then you get a non-contingent reward. In other words, you get a reward at the end, not because you're having to jump through a hoop And of these, my personal favorite, the one that I always use, is non-contingent power. So if my daughter does a random act of kindness, I say congratulations for this, and I don't try to pin it on something else. I don't do a contingent. If you get this, you'll get that, because that channels reward power and it channels the expectation that you're always going to get something for nothing. Okay. And so this is how we go about framing our influences strategies, and whether or not they're successful depends very much on how we spin the message. All right. And that's why those of you who know how to do this really well, it is to your advantage. Okay. All right, we're finished with power. On the weekend, I'll send a video. And remember, no position paper, and I will see you Tuesday.
The personal powers and the